Ladies and gentlemen, Noam Chomsky.
Thank you. Well, I have to begin with a little of that well-deserved humility that you were just hearing about. The phrase Imperial Grand Strategy, I can't take credit for or maybe blame for. I plagiarized it from the leading establishment journal in international affairs, foreign affairs, in an article that appeared by a well-known international relations specialist, John Eikenberry. It appeared in October 2002, immediately after the rather spectacular announcement a few weeks earlier of the Bush administration's national security strategy. And Eikenberry is referring to what he called the new Imperial Grand Strategy, referring to it very critically, as many others did, right in the foreign policy elite. The national security strategy, as I'm sure you know, announces that the United States government intends to dominate the world permanently by force, if necessary, the dimension in which the U.S. is supreme, the only dimension, and it also arrogates to itself the right to attack and destroy any potential perceived challenge to that domination. It's worth noting before going on that is not entirely without precedent. And there are precedents in other countries which, out of politeness, I won't refer to, but there are some precedents in our own history which, in my opinion at least, everyone ought to know in a society that values the freedoms that have been won. So, for example, back in the early days of World War II, before the United States entered the war, there were high-level planning meetings involving high State Department officials and members of the Council on Foreign Relations, the organization that publishes foreign affairs. It's basically the foreign policy elite, called War Peace Studies programs, interesting, detailed studies of the post-war world. They're particularly interesting because many of those policies were then implemented. Not surprisingly, it's pretty much the same people, the same interests. And one of the main themes back in 1941, I'm now quoting it, was that the U.S. in the post-war world would hold unquestioned power, acting to ensure the limitation of sovereignty by those who might interfere with the policy to achieve military and economic supremacy for the United States. The wording is not very different from the national security strategy. And there are many examples since, including the Clinton administration. So the Clinton administration was open and explicit that it declared the right to take unilateral military action, if necessary, in order to secure access to markets and resources. Again, sort of the theme of the national security strategy, and there are many others. Nevertheless, the Bush national security strategy did arouse many shudders around the world, including the foreign policy elite at home, but not because the wording was so different, but because of the character of it. It was very brazen and defiant and in your face. It was a warning to the world. Furthermore, it was accompanied, the others were kind of internal, among ourselves, discussions of what's in our pocket. And that's a difference. Furthermore, it was immediately accompanied by actions to demonstrate that it was meant very seriously. I don't have time to talk about all these, but some of them were quite important. They included immediate announcement of highly aggressive military plans now in operation, which are very threatening to peace in the world and to us, and also immediate steps to undermine international agreements that might ban or at least limit threats to us, like bacteriological warfare, militarization of space, and so on. But the most brazen declaration, and this was understood, was the announcement at the same time, September 2002, that the United States intended to invade Iraq. That invasion was understood to be what's sometimes called an exemplary action. That is an action taken to demonstrate to the world that the doctrine that had just been announced was intended very seriously, and that the U.S. would indeed, under this leadership, resort to force at will, without any credible pretext, and without international authority, just reliance on force. The New York Times, after the war was over, pointed out correctly that Iraq is intended to be the first test case of the doctrine, not the last, the petri dish in which the doctrine is being developed. Critics, like Eikenberry and many others, warned right away that both the doctrine and its implementation are likely to severely increase threats to the world and to the United States. They are likely to increase the threat of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and of terror. And the logic is very straightforward. It doesn't take a genius to figure it out. If you announce to people, I'm going to attack you, they don't respond by saying, thank you, sir, I'm waiting. They'll try to work out some way to deter that attack. And the range of potential targets is quite vast. And nobody can compete with the United States in military force. The U.S. spends approximately as much as the rest of the world combined and is far more advanced. So they'll turn to the weapons that are available to the weak. And there are such weapons. Weapons of mass destruction, for example, are available to the weak. So is terror available to the weak. And sooner or later, they're going to be combined. There are many ways in which weapons of mass destruction can be used in terrorist acts. If you want a small picture, just take a look at California the last couple of weeks. I don't know who set off those fires, but any self-respecting terrorist in the world certainly got the message that it's extremely easy to cause vast destruction in the United States with nothing more than a couple of matches. And it's well known that it's not that hard to sneak the parts of nuclear weapons into a New York hotel room. One of the leading specialists at Harvard, Graham Allison, pointed out only semi-jocularly a couple of years ago, this is before 9/11, that the easiest way to get a nuclear weapon into New York City would be to wrap it in a bale of marijuana and send it through New York Harbor. And he's actually, the point he's making is in fact correct. I mean, there are innumerable ways to do this, and if you try to raise to encourage people to engage in terror and development of weapons of mass destruction simply out of deterrence or for revenge, you're asking for disaster. And in fact, the predictions of intelligence agencies and independent analysts, which were pretty uniform about the invasion of Iraq, have apparently been verified. The same sources are now saying that it was a huge setback in the war on terror. It encouraged, there was a sharp spike, I'm quoting, in recruitment for al-Qaeda-style organizations. Experts on North Korea and Iran have pointed out right away that this is undoubtedly a stimulus to them to develop weapons of mass destruction, and for all the perfectly obvious reasons. Well, you know, this is part of the reason for the really quite unprecedented critique of both the doctrine and the war all over the world, but including the foreign policy elite at home. I can think of more principled criticisms, but those narrow ones are very striking. There's been no precedent for this. The national security doctrine itself barely mentions, scarcely mentions international law or institutions. The Bush administration immediately made it evident to the United Nations that the Security Council could be relevant. That's the word that was used. The Security Council could be relevant by giving its meaningless stamp of approval to a war that the United States was going to carry out anyway, or else, as Colin Powell explained to them, they could be a debating society. So that's your choice. Either be relevant and catch up, as administration spokesman put it, give a stamp of approval to what we're going to do, or be a debating society. Shortly after that, the World Economic Forum had its meeting in Davos, Switzerland last January. Now, these are the corporate executives who pay $30,000 to rub shoulders with each other, and the political great and so on. They're the people who the business press calls the masters of the universe. Just a bare touch of irony, but not too much. It's pretty accurate. The main issue at the Davos meeting was the forthcoming war in Iraq, to which they were bitterly opposed. Colin Powell, who's supposed to be the moderate, was sent as the emissary to try to explain U.S. policy to them. He informed them that the United States, I'm quoting him, the United States has the sovereign right to use military force. When we feel strongly about something, we will lead. And we will lead even if nobody's following us, as in this case. Well, that got a very hostile reaction from the masters of the universe, which is an important fact. And as I said, intelligence agencies and independent analysts predicted, and the prediction has now been fulfilled, and will continue to be, that these actions stimulate reactions which will end up being extremely harmful to the United States, and at this level of destructive capacity may be destructive of the human species. It's not a joke anymore. We're at the level where that's within reach. Well, the Bush administration understands all this. The planners are perfectly intelligent. They don't want these outcomes. It's just that threats to Americans are just not a very high priority. There are more important issues. More important issues are maintaining the very narrow hold on political power that they have, and it's extremely narrow, so as to enable them to carry out very far-reaching plans. That includes domestic plans, which I don't have time to talk about, but they're extremely significant. They quite plainly want to roll back all more or less progressive legislation of the past century, programs that have been developed to protect people from the ravages of market forces, while at the same time creating a very powerful state. They're by no means conservatives, to protect the interests of the rich and powerful. That's an audacious plan and very important to them, and they show you how they're going to do it. They also intend to carry out the program of global domination by force if necessary, and crucially with regard to the Middle East because of its oil resources. I'll come back to that in a moment. They know perfectly well that their own policies, domestic policies, are highly unpopular. There's no debate about that. Karl Rove, who's the chief political planner for the administration, had already in the summer of 2002 informed party activists that for the forthcoming midterm elections, the November 2002 elections, they were going to have to stress national security issues and try to suppress the social and economic policies, which are very harmful, not only to the population, but to our children and grandchildren. They're going to have to pay for all of this and pay badly. And therefore, the policies are unpopular, so they have to be suppressed. And the only way of maintaining political power will be to press the panic button, to frighten people. Frighten them enough so they'll huddle under the umbrella of power, defense against the demonic enemy, who's constructed by a massive state media propaganda campaign. Notice that all of this took place at the same time. The announcement of the national security strategy, the announcement of the invasion of Iraq, the dismantling of treaties, and the onset of the political campaign beginning in September. And they're all connected and understood to be connected. Well, kind of worked. Within a few weeks, U.S. public opinion was driven off the international spectrum, literally. After a couple of weeks of propaganda, over half the population believed that Iraq was a serious threat to the security of the United States. Pretty soon, a majority believed that Iraq was involved in the September 11th attacks, maybe responsible for them, that it was linked up with al-Qaeda, that it was developing weapons of mass destruction, and so on. Furthermore, these beliefs were very closely correlated with support for war. As people who had the belief supported the war, which is not very surprising. I mean, if I believed those things, I'd have supported the war too. Makes sense under those conditions. Worth noting that the United States is alone on this, alone on the planet. Even the countries that were invaded by Saddam Hussein, Iran and Kuwait, didn't regard him as a threat. They hated him, delighted to have him drawn and quartered, but they understood it's not a threat. In fact, it was the weakest country in the region. It was practically devastated by sanctions, the murderous sanctions that had killed hundreds of thousands of people. The country was held together by Scotch tape. It had been almost completely disarmed, otherwise the U.S. wouldn't have attacked it. It had its military spending military budget was about a third of Kuwait's. Kuwait had 10% of the population, and it was much weaker than the surrounding countries. And of course, they're all far weaker than the regional superpower, Israel, which is effectively a military base of the United States at this point, and dominates them all. So the threat of Iraq was perceived by nobody outside the U.S. The regional countries, including Kuwait and Iran, had been trying to reintegrate Iraq back into their own regional system over strong U.S. objections. But the U.S. was driven off the spectrum. It's a pretty spectacular achievement, and stays so. In May of this year, you'll recall May 1st, there was an extravaganza which elicited a combination of ridicule and fear around the world, but was hailed here. The president landed in combat gear in an aircraft carrier that was carefully placed so you got the right TV images behind it and so on and so forth. Instead of laughing, the press took it seriously, at least pretended to. The front page story in the New York Times reported that Bush on the aircraft carrier gave a powerful Reagan-esque finale. I'll come back to the phrase for the war in Iraq. The more serious more astute commentators like the Wall Street Journal reported that this isn't a victory in the war speech. It was the first stage. It was the opening, they said, of the 2004 presidential election campaign, which is going to have to be built on national security themes for the same reason that the midterm elections were. And Karl Rove was kind enough to point out right afterwards that yes, that indeed is true. They're going to have to focus on how by conquering Iraq, the United States won a battle in the war on terror. Of course, the war is going to go on, so you have to make sure we have this powerful leader who can land on aircraft carriers wearing combat gear. That's got to be the theme of the campaign, and it does work. Also, it's worth bearing in mind that all of this is second nature to the people now running the country. Remember, they're mostly recycled from more reactionary sectors of the Reagan and Bush #1 administrations, and that's the way they held on to power for 12 years, just by terrifying the country. Worked so well that Bush on the aircraft carrier could announce a victory on the war on terror by defeating Iraq. The only known connection between Iraq and terror is the one I mentioned, that the invasion of Iraq increased the threat of terror. On radio, his radio addresses and others continue the same theme. So a recent radio address, Bush announced that the world is safer today because we ended a regime that cultivated ties to terror while it built weapons of mass destruction. Well, you know, his speechwriters and his handlers know perfectly well that that's a total fabrication, but it doesn't matter. It's a kind of a higher truth. And they know that if you repeat it loudly enough and often enough, it'll somehow become truth. It'll get into people's heads. Doesn't matter what the facts are. For the November 2002 election, it barely worked by a very small number of votes, a few tens of thousands, but enough to hang on to political power. And exit polls demonstrated that Karl Rove's reasoning was correct. People kept their preferences, they changed their priorities. So they decided that protecting ourselves from the demon is more important than having a job or some way to take care of your elderly mother or something like that, at least temporarily, and it does continue to work. In October of last year, 2002, Congress passed a resolution authorizing the president to use force in Iraq because of the threat to the security of the United States posed by the government of Iraq. Again, that's unique in the world. The countries that Saddam invaded didn't have any such illusions. The press was kind, and intellectuals, so-called, were kind enough not to remind us that Congress was plagiarizing too. In 1985, President Reagan declared a national emergency in the United States because of what he called the unusual and extraordinary threat to the security of the United States posed by the government of Nicaragua. 2 days driving time from Harlingen, Texas. And notice that was a much worse threat. That was unusual and extraordinary, not just a threat. And it worked. What about the powerful Reagan-esque finale? What's the New York Times talking about? Well, those of you who are old enough to remember will recall what it was. It was Reagan's dramatic speech about how we are finally again standing tall after having conquered the nutmeg capital of the world, Grenada, where 6,000 U.S. Special Forces succeeded in overcoming the resistance of a couple of dozen middle-aged construction workers, killing several dozen of each other in the process, and earning 8,000 medals for it. So we were standing tall. That's the powerful Reagan-esque finale. And believe it or not, that worked too. People were terrified about the threat posed by Grenada. And so it continued right through the 80s, year after year, including domestic threats. You'll recall, again, those of you who are old enough, that Bush #1 managed to win the 1988 election by a straight race card. Vote for me or black rapists are going to go after your sister. That was the leading theme. Fear of crime and drugs in the United States are approximately like other industrial societies. Problem, but not out of control. On the other hand, fear of crime and fear of drugs are way beyond other industrial societies. One of the reasons why the prison population has gone out of sight. So since the Reagan years, the U.S. is by far the leader in this respect among any comparable countries. Those are ways to keep the population frightened. And you have to do that if you're carrying out policies that harm them. And these policies do harm them. You may not recall, but by 1992, Reagan was the most unpopular living ex-president, ranking right next to Nixon, way below Carter and Ford. But you can keep control that way, in the short term at least, and that's what they're counting on. Well, why was Iraq a test case? Not, say, Liberia or Eastern Congo, where massive atrocities were going on. With a fraction of the troops that were sent to Iraq or the cost, the U.S. could have terminated horrendous atrocities. Liberia is a particularly striking case because it's the closest there is in Africa to a U.S. colony. It was recognized in 1862, the same year as Haiti, and for the same reason. The Emancipation Proclamation was freeing the slaves, and we got to get rid of them somehow. So maybe you can send them to Black Africa or to Haiti. And since then, the U.S. has really exploited Liberia extensively and has quite a responsibility for the atrocities that are going on now. So why not send troops there, or Eastern Congo? Well, there's a good reason. Nothing is gained by preventing massive atrocities, so there's no point in that. On the other hand, Iraq is important. It's very different. It's right in the middle of the world's major energy reserves. In fact, Iraq itself has the second largest known energy reserves. And this is a crucial issue. Back in 1945, during the post-war planning period, the State Department recognized the Gulf region as, in their words, a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history. Eisenhower added that it is the strategically most important area in the world. And obviously the U.S. is going to control it for those reasons. And it's now expected to be even more important. The National Intelligence Council, which combination of the intelligence agencies, released a prediction for its own prognosis for the next 15 years or so. And they predict that that region will produce about 2/3 of the world's energy. Therefore, the U.S. has to control it. Notice that the word is control, not access. They don't expect the U.S. to depend on that oil. In fact, they expect the United States to rely on more stable resources in the Western Hemisphere and West Africa. But you have to control it. In fact, if the U.S. shifted to, say, solar energy 100%, it would still have to control that energy resource because of exactly the reasons that the State Department pointed out back at the end of the war. It's an enormous material prize. It yields what one standard history of the oil industry called profits beyond the dreams of avarice for the energy corporations, and a huge flow of capital to the rest of the U.S. economy. It's not just oil company profits, it's armaments, massive flow of armaments, cycles back here, feeds into high-tech industry generally. Armaments and high-tech are closely linked. The massive construction projects, purchase of treasury securities at an unknown but important level for a country that has been a serious debtor since Reagan and now again Bush. Again, these people are not conservatives. They drive the country into massive debts for the future generations to worry about. And aside from that, it is a lever of world control. Back in 50 years ago, U.S. planners recognized that control over the world's oil resources gives the U.S. what was called veto power over what potential competitors might want to do. And they're not talking about Russia or Osama bin Laden. They were talking about Europe and Japan. Veto power over the potential competitors. That's become much more by controlling their energy reserves and also the sea lanes. That's important. A lot of the jockeying in Central Asia and the Middle East right now has to do with that. Particularly in the last 30 years, it's been recognized that the world has become economically what's called tripolar, three major economic centers, U.S.-based North America, Germany and France-based Europe, and that 30 years ago, Japan-based Asia by now with the rise of the newly industrialized countries there. And China, it's more complex, but it's a very rich area. In fact, the most dynamic economic area in the world right now is Northeast Asia. Its gross domestic product is about 1/3 of the global total, far higher than the United States. It holds about half the foreign exchange in the world. It's growing rapidly as major industrial economies, enormous resources in Siberia, pipelines going in all over the place. North Korea happens to be right in the middle of it. That's part of the reason for, in itself, it's of no significance geopolitically, but in terms of its position it is. The U.S. is not at all happy about this becoming an integrated region with its own resources that might go in its own way. It's never been, the U.S. has always been ambivalent about European unification. It was in favor of it for various reasons, but also concerned that it might go in its own path. The venomous hatred of France and Germany in the last year is not only because of the elite hatred of democracy, which is fantastic. I've never seen anything like it. You know, the demonstration in the last year is astonishing. Just take a look at the New Europe, Old Europe distinction, which passed almost without comment. I mean, the bad guys, Old Europe, were the countries where the governments took the same position as the large majority of the population. The good guys, New Europe, like France and Spain, they were Hungary, they were the countries where the government overruled an even larger majority of the population, took their orders from Crawford, Texas. That made them good. The others are bad. If there's, I can't recall anything like this as a demonstration of contempt, fear, and hatred of democracy. But that's not the only reason for the anger at France and Germany. They are the industrial and commercial heartland of Europe. If they go off on an independent course, the world does become very hard to control. Force is significant. You can't do everything with it. Well, how was the U.S. going to control the stupendous source of strategic power? Back to 1945. Remember, this area had been primarily controlled by England and France. The United States was involved, but secondarily. France was simply expelled, kicked them out. England was reduced to what the British Foreign Office regretfully called a junior partner. They could be a junior partner in world control, kind of the U.S. Gurkhas. You know, you call them in if you need some muscle, but we'll run the show. And they accepted that. That's called the special relationship. The U.S. took over, basically took over the British framework for governing the region. You look back at declassified British Foreign Office records from the First World War as they were planning how they were going to run the region, again, mostly for oil reasons. They decided to set up what they would call independent states, but they would be, in their words, an Arab facade behind which the British would effectively rule under various fictions. Iraq was one of them. They created Iraq with the boundaries it has to guarantee that the British would have control of the oil, not the Turks in the north, certainly not the Iraqis, and that Iraq would be barred from access to the sea to keep it under control. That's called Kuwait, which was to be a British colony, another Arab facade. This had nothing to do with the interests or wishes of Iraqis, which is irrelevant. That kind of worked too. It worked until 1958, in fact, which is a long time in world affairs. The U.S. has got the same plan. It's hoping to be able to establish a client state in Iraq, which will be called a democracy or independent or something, but it'll be an Arab facade behind which the U.S. will rule. An economic plan has already been imposed on them, which sells out the entire country to foreign, mostly U.S. corporations, and more is to come. And if they get out of line, there's muscle in reserve. At least that's the thought. Hasn't been working too well, rather surprisingly, I think. But anyway, that's pretty clearly the plan. The U.S. did take over essentially the same framework, but it added an extra layer, which has turned out to be quite important. The extra layer of control added by U.S. planners was what the Nixon administration called local cops on the beat. Okay, so police headquarters is in Washington, and there's a branch office in London, but they're going to be local cops on the beat, namely what are called peripheral states, states surrounding the oil-producing region preferably non-Arab. The idea is they find it easier to kill Arabs. So Turkey was the main one from the beginning. Iran was another after the United States had overthrown the parliamentary regime in 1953 and installed the tyrannical and brutal rule of the Shah. Pakistan was another. They're the peripheral states, the local cops on the beat. U.S.-Israel relations, which are quite unique in world affairs, they developed in this context. In 1948, just to pick a couple of high points, in 1948, the Joint Chiefs, the U.S. didn't have a very close relation to Israel then, but the Joint Chiefs of Staff were quite impressed by Israel's military prowess and recognized that it, in their judgment, was the most important military force in the region, second only to Turkey. Turkey was already in Washington's pocket, and they pointed out that potentially this might be a reasonable base for U.S. power in the region, replacing Britain, which was declining. In 1958, 10 years later, that plan, that thought got a lot of substance. 1958 was a very significant year in world affairs, in particular in the Middle East. The Eisenhower administration, we know this now from declassified secret documents, the Eisenhower administration identified three major crises in 1958, North Africa, Indonesia, and the Middle East, all Islamic, all oil producers, at that time secular Islamic. They pointed out that Russia had absolutely nothing to do with it, which is correct, and that's pretty typical of the Cold War. Those were the three crises. The one in the Middle East had to do with the overthrow of the British-run Arab facade in Iraq. There was a military coup. They threw out the British-run rulers. And that was considered, the real villain there was Nasser, president of Egypt, who was regarded as, who was in fact the leader of secular Arab nationalism, and very frightening to Britain and the United States because independent nationalism is the most dangerous force in the world. The problem in Indonesia was similar. Sukarno was regarded as the leader of independent Indonesian nationalism. Nasser and Sukarno were two of the pillars of the non-aligned movement, which the U.S. really hated with a passion. It was a potential independent source for the whole third world. Actually, rather similar things were going on in India and Latin America at the same time. I should say, just looking ahead, that these three crises were resolved. In North Africa, the crisis was resolved by Algerian independence, which quieted the region. The U.S. didn't want France in there. In Indonesia, the crisis was resolved by a huge massacre, which the CIA described as comparable to the crimes of Stalin, Hitler, and Mao. Mostly landless peasants, maybe 1 million people slaughtered in a couple of months, described pretty accurately here. New York Times called it a staggering mass slaughter and so on, and greeted with complete unrestrained euphoria. You should look back at the commentary at the time, because it destroyed the only mass popular movement in the country. It destroyed the parliamentary system, which was just too democratic, and it eliminated a base for the non-aligned movement and put the big country oil producer right back in the U.S. pocket. In the Middle East, Israel performed the same function. The 1967 war destroyed Nasser, destroyed what's called radical independent nationalism. And that's really when the U.S.-Israel alliance firms up. Going back to 1958, it was recognized by the National Security Council and President Eisenhower that, as they put it, a logical corollary of opposition to Arab nationalism would be reliance on Israel as the only stable base for U.S. power in the region outside of Turkey and Iran, and taken for granted. Well, so things went on until 1973, when Sadat, in fact, invaded Egyptian territory, as he said he was going to do, if the U.S. and Israel refused political settlement. And that was a near disaster for Israel. It led to a nuclear alert in the United States, hence a near disaster for the world. At that time, Kissinger understood you can't just discount Egypt and Arabs generally. He began his famous shuttle diplomacy, which led finally to the Camp David agreements in 1978. And it's interesting the way they're described. That's Carter, they're described as a diplomatic triumph of the United States, a peak point in the peace process. In fact, it was a diplomatic catastrophe. What the United States accepted in 1978 was what Sadat had proposed in 1971, except by 1978 it was, from the U.S. and Israeli point of view, a much harsher version, because by then the Palestinian issue was on the agenda. So Sadat did call for Palestinian state in the West Bank and in the occupied territories, which he hadn't mentioned in 71. Nevertheless, the U.S. propaganda system is sufficiently well-oiled so that this diplomatic catastrophe becomes a diplomatic triumph. Carter wins the Nobel Prize and so on. But if you look back, you'll find out that's exactly what happened. Israel recognized openly at the time that with Egypt, the main military force of the Arab states, eliminated from the conflict, they would be free to enhance, expand the integration and occupation of the territories under military occupation, and also to attack their northern neighbor freely, as they started to do in 1978, major invasion in 1982, relying on massive U.S. support. By then, almost half of U.S. foreign aid was going to them. The Palestinian issue had come onto the agenda by the mid-'70s. 1976 was the first Security Council resolution calling for a two-state settlement in Israel, Palestine, on the international border, maybe some minor adjustment, incorporating all the main wording of UN 242, so recognition of the right of all states to live in peace and security, guaranteed borders, et cetera, Israel refused to attend the session in retaliation against the UN for discussing it. It bombed Lebanon, killing about 50 people without any pretext. The U.S. vetoed the resolution, the first direct rejection of a political settlement by the U.S., and no time to go through the record, but if you bother to check, you'll find that it continues until this minute. From the mid-'70s until today, the United States has unilaterally blocked a political settlement that is supported by virtually the entire world, including the leading Arab states, PLO, everybody. That's the way it goes from then until now, with literally no break. In 1982, the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, which killed about 20,000 people, it was no joke, was explicitly, no secret about it, an effort to undermine PLO diplomatic efforts. It was not a response to terror. There wasn't any terror across the borders except for Israeli bombing in an effort to elicit a provocation. It was backed by the U.S., which vetoed a couple of Security Council resolutions to stop the slaughter and invasion, and it was just an effort to eliminate the PLO as a negotiating partner. It was called, in fact, a war for the West Bank, and that's correct. Pretty much falsified here, but the facts are, again, very plain. Well, by 1991, right after the Gulf War, the U.S. was in complete control of the region, made it very clear it was going to run it, and it assumed, the Bush #1 administration assumed that they could impose their own extreme rejectionist settlement on the Israel-Palestine issue. You may not recall, or you may not know, because the facts were never published here, although they're on the official record, you can read them in the State Department bulletin, that their own proposal was that there can be no additional Palestinian state between Jordan and Israel, additional because Jordan is a Palestinian state, and that the future of the occupied territories have to be settled in accordance with the guidelines of the State of Israel. That was the official, it's called the Baker Plan, official Bush-Baker position, which strikingly was never published here, although it's official. I mean, published around the margins, like I wrote about it, a couple other people did. 1991, Gulf War's over, you can impose your own solution. The Madrid negotiations began, but there was a problem there too. The Palestinians delegation was led by a conservative nationalist, man of great integrity and probably the most respected person in the occupied territories, Haider Abdel-Shafi, and he simply refused to accept a settlement which would permit Israel, with U.S. backing, to continue its settlement, occupation, and integration of the occupied territories. So there was a stalemate. Well, fortunately, Arafat stepped in. He presumably understood that his support in the occupied territories and the refugee camps was collapsing, and he moved in by the back door through Oslo to undercut the Palestinian delegation and to accept a settlement in which he would essentially be the local boss running the Arab facade, which would do the work of Israel in the United States for it. He would torture dissidents, suppress dissent, have a huge security force, rob like mad, but nobody cares about that, build villas for his friends, but do the job that Israel and the United States wanted while U.S.-backed Israeli settlement went on. That's the famous Oslo Accords, perfectly obvious at once. And so it continued right through the 1990s. The last Clinton year, which was also the last Barack year, 2000, Israeli settlement in the occupied territories reached the peak since before Oslo. That is exactly what led to the Intifada. The Camp David II agreements, this is now summer 2000, were presented here almost unanimously, unless you looked at specialist literature or dissident literature. It was presented here as a magnanimous offer, very generous, giving the Palestinians everything they wanted, but the vicious Arafat wants to drive all the Jews into the sea, so refused to accept it, and that they preferred violence. It's an easy way to test that, very easy way. Take a look at a map and see what the offer was. Maps were available. They were published in Israel. They were available in the standard scholarly sources here. No one has found a single map in the entire U.S. media. That's discipline, gotta admire it. As soon as you look at the map, it's not that they're getting orders, no orders. I mean, it's just self-discipline of the intellectual classes. As soon as you look at the map, you see why none were presented. They break the West Bank into 3 separated cantons, virtually no communication, all separated from a small part of Jerusalem, which is the center of Palestinian commercial, educational, whatever, the rest of their existence, and of course all separated from Gaza. That's the magnanimous offer, so obviously you can't show a map. Intifada started, a lot of violence, but negotiations continued. Informally, but at a high level. They continued until a meeting in January 2001, Taba, which did produce a document which is extensively described in the Israeli press and well known in Europe, but as far as I know unmentioned here, which was a considerable improvement over the impossible Camp David arrangements. Unfortunately, Israel pulled out of those negotiations, and they were never resumed in the increasing cycle of violence. However, we have just learned that informally they were continued. And just a couple of weeks ago, another plan came along called the Geneva Accords, again, barely mentioned in the U.S., which is crucial. It's supported by most of the top Palestinian authorities, and in Israel by influential people, including the former chief of staff, General Mitzna as head of the Labor Party, and others. And it is, in my view, a reasonable basis for discussion about a political settlement. It's got, you could argue about this and that, but it's a big improvement over anything that came before. Well, again, the crucial question is, how's the U.S. going to react? Because how's the boss man called partner going to react? And the answer so far is silence. That means no media coverage as well. The media are disciplined and no discussion of it. So it's not on the agenda. Well, how does the U.S. population feel about it? For one thing, people can't have a clue about what's going on because almost nothing that I've just described is published, although it's all perfectly straight off the public record. Well, the public has maintained support for the international consensus, which is pretty remarkable because there's been no articulate support for it here. The most recent polls show about 2/3 of the public supporting what's called the Saudi plan, which is just another version of the international consensus, full peace treaty in return for withdrawal. The same majority calls for the United States to become more involved in the peace process, and people don't know that that's a contradiction because it's precisely the U.S. involvement that has prevented the peace process that's been going on since the mid-'70s. But you can't know that unless you know undertake a research project. So it's there, but unknown. The leading polling agency in the country, or in the world, in fact, the Program on International Policy Attitudes at the University of Maryland, about a year ago, published extensive and in-depth polls of public opinion on this, and the results are pretty startling. They were never mentioned in the press. The results were that a large majority of the population thinks the U.S. ought to terminate aid, all aid, to either of the two partners that's refusing to enter into good faith negotiations. People didn't know that at the time of the poll that meant cutting off all aid to Israel, but very few people knew that. In the event that both parties were involved in negotiations, same majority called for equalizing aid to Israel and the Palestinians. People who answered that question haven't the slightest idea that what they're advocating is radically opposed to U.S. policy, and they probably think they're alone in those views. That would be a safe bet, since they never hear them anywhere. Nobody knows what the answers would be if these issues were ever discussed. Well, Washington's isolation in international affairs is extraordinary and dangerous. International polls for the last year reveal overwhelming opposition to U.S. policy and really profound mistrust of the leadership, verging on fear and hatred. Those are very bad omens for the future. And they're part of the reason for the unprecedented internal elite opposition to Bush's foreign policy militancy. That's particularly true with regard to the Middle East. So after the Gulf War, the Iraq War, one of the major research institutes found, I'm quoting it, that the war widened the huge rift between Americans and Europeans, further inflamed the Muslim world, softened support for the war on terror, and significantly weakened global public support for the UN and NATO, which are perceived as subordinated to the U.S. Within Iraq, the latest polls, which are pretty startling too, reveal that the foreign leader with the highest favorability rating is French President Jacques Chirac, who was the most outspoken opponent of the war, the invasion. 2/3 of the population now regards the U.S. as an occupying force, 15% a liberating force. Half the population wants the U.S. forces to leave, despite the consequences for security in the post-invasion environment. About 1/3 want them to stay. By about 2-to-1, Iraqis feel that the conditions for peace and security have gotten worse in the past 3 months. With regard to Israel, U.S. isolation is even greater. First, Washington is isolated from its own population, as I just pointed out, but it's much beyond that. Just a poll a couple of days ago revealed that 60% of Europeans regard Israel as the greatest threat to world peace, with the United States right behind. The United States, it's 53% ranked with North Korea and Iran. Now, frankly, I suspect that they didn't ask the question properly. I think if they had asked the question properly, the 60% attitude toward Israel would have been U.S. support for Israel. That's probably what's regarded as the major threat to world peace. The most recent break between Washington and the rest of the world on these issues, and it's significant, has to do with what's called Israel's security fence. That's a huge construction that's snaking its way through the West Bank, isolating towns and villages. It's taking some of the most fertile land in the West Bank and crucial water supplies, and it's leaving, according to the World Bank, hundreds of thousands of people pretty much destitute, and most of the population effectively imprisoned. Just recently, Israel announced that Palestinians living on the Israeli side of the wall will have to request permits to live in the homes that they've been living in. They and their families have been living in for hundreds of years. Of course, Israelis are allowed to settle there without any permits. That's bitterly denounced inside Israel by civil libertarians. Amira Haas, a fine journalist who writes for Haaretz, the main journal, just pointed out that it's the gateway to expulsion, step by step, not dramatic enough so people will object, but step-by-step gateway to expulsion, which is plausible. Well, the most recent break, recently, the UN condemned the building of the wall. U.S. vetoed it. Just recently, Washington announced that it no longer has any objection to the construction. By that, it separates itself from its closest allies, including the quartet that's supposedly running the roadmap to peace. Notice the terminology. It's very revealing. So it's called a security fence. Suppose the goal were security. Where would you build the fence? Answer, very simple. A couple of miles inside Israel. Then you can make the fence a mile high. The Israeli army can patrol on both sides. They can mine it with nuclear weapons if they like on the other side. They can do anything they want, without interfering with, without violating the fundamental principles of international humanitarian law and without any protest. So if you want security, that's what you do. Of course, you don't do that for several reasons. For one thing, it would not incorporate Palestinian land inside Israel, including rich and important land. Then it would inconvenience Israelis instead of Palestinians. So therefore, it's unthinkable. Nevertheless, it's called the security fence, which is an interesting illustration of what, if we were honest about ourselves, we would call simply outright racism. I mean, there isn't a mention of any of this anywhere. Do a research project. See if you find any notice of this fact. It's not a profound insight. It's trivial. If the goal is security, it's obvious what you would do. If the goal is expansion and imprisonment and a gateway to expulsion, you do something else. That's what the fence is. Not hard to figure out. There's more to say about this, but it's getting late. Let me return to the Imperial grand strategy. It is, in fact, posing a very stark choice for all of us, for Americans. The critics inside the establishment are quite correct to point out that the Imperial grand strategy intensifies threats to us and our children. We can add something that they don't, that it imposes even greater threats to others, and if we think it through, it poses very significant threats to human survival. However, none of this is graven in stone. It's all extremely fragile. The good news, and we all know it, is that we have the ability and we have the opportunities to change this course and to use our incomparable wealth and power for constructive ends. And the crucial question is, as always, do we have the will? And it's hard to overestimate how much hangs on the answer to that question.